this is where we are, correct? Last time was Civil War, right? Reconstruction, what does that mean? It means reconstructing the American Union as it had been before the Civil War. Putting America back together again, if you will. Reintegrating those states that had seceded to form the Confederacy. Reintegrating them back into the United States of America. That's what Reconstruction means. The black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois called it, looking back, a splendid failure. Splendid for what it briefly was and what it could have and should have been, but instead a failure for reasons that we will see. So you know what Reconstruction means in general, reconstructing the American Union, putting America back together again after secession and a bloody Civil War. But there was still some question as to what exactly it would include. What would it mean in practice, not in theory? In other words, what would you make those seceded states do to get back into the Union? I'd simply say we're sorry for seceding and starting the Civil War. Sorry for a war that cost the lives of 600,000 people, and an action which the government of the United States considered to be unconstitutional. Would you allow, somebody like Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, or Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, to run for office and participate in, attending conventions that would draft new state constitutions and petition the U.S. government to come back into the Union? Would you ban those people? Would you perhaps prosecute those people for treason and have them executed? Or would it be somewhere between those two extremes of, we'll just say we're sorry and we're going to prosecute and execute you? Furthermore, who gets to answer that question? Who's in charge? The Constitution, after all, doesn't speculate on what you would do if you had a fratricidal, bloody civil war that split the nation in two, and then you had to put it back together again. There's no guidance. Would Congress take the lead? Would it be the president who was in charge? What role would the Supreme Court play? And so on. As it turns out, during the war itself, during the latter years of the Civil War, Lincoln initially takes charge. Through executive orders, he kind of answers that question of who is in charge for himself. But, as we will see, eventually members of Congress take over and initiate a new period that becomes known as Congressional Reconstruction. So we have these two broad periods characterized by who is setting the terms of what Reconstruction policy would be. Between 1863 and 66, it's the president setting the terms of what Reconstruction would be, including Lincoln and the man who succeeds him, Andrew Johnson. But Congress wrests or takes control of Reconstruction away from Johnson in 1866, and we enter a period known as Congressional Reconstruction or Black Reconstruction, and we'll see why it is given that name. That make sense? Now, for what they called back then freedmen, that is, freedmen and women, former slaves, who by virtue of the 13th Amendment would become free. This represents a real social revolution. In terms of family, slave owners had exerted quite a bit of power over slaves' social life and family. And now former slaves could settle down and live as a nuclear family, husband, wife, and children. The women could retire from field work and work as homemakers. rearing the children, who could now, by the way, get an education, which they couldn't do under slavery. And the men could be a true head of household, tending to the fields. That is, if you could be reunited. The war had caused a tremendous amount of displacement, particularly because so many slaves were running away to get behind Union lines, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation meant they wouldn't be considered contraband of war, they would be in fact free. And so it takes some effort for people to get reunited with one another in terms of family and community. There is at least, under Presidential Reconstruction, a Freedmen's Bureau within the Department of the Army that assists slaves in reuniting and provides immediate needs, or helps to provide immediate needs like food and clothing and so on. And once people are reunited and can sort of get settled again, this allows for the establishment of new communities with churches, by the way. Now, black people in the South had followed the lead of those in the North early on in the 1820s and 30s and had attempted to start separate black denominations, especially Baptists in the South. In the North, it was African Methodist Episcopal. But after there was an attempted rebellion tied to some local black churches, slaveholders generally prevented black people from having their own independent denominations until, of course, slavery is no more. And so we do see the establishment of independent black churches in the South, including Black Baptist, including AME, or African Methodist Episcopal, and its cousin, AME Zion, each of which would, by the end of this period, have hundreds of thousands of congregants. The Freedmen's Bureau, by the way, also helps with the establishment of black schools for the first time. Once you get settled in communities, you establish churches, and you can establish schools for a people, by the way, who, when slavery is first ended, are 90% illiterate, because as a general rule, slaves were not allowed to learn to read and write. That number is drastically reduced by the end of the century through the creation of schools, including not just K through 12 schools, but, as we'll see, colleges and universities, many of them what we call normal schools. Normal schools were colleges established specifically for teaching teachers, which was a great need when you're going from no schools to trying to teach a mass population of millions of people. And there are, of course, the HBCUs. I can't remember if I talked about this or not, but in Hampton, Virginia, there was a fort that the Union Army had held onto, unlike at Fort Sumter, where they were, of course, driven out, but they held onto it for the entire war, and it becomes a haven for runaway slaves. It was the general there, Benjamin Butler, who had come up with the idea of Contraband of War to allow him to hold on to those slaves and pay them wages to work, let them establish a school. That school becomes Hampton University. One of the early Southern HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities, which sets the model for there are two major types of HBCUs at that time. And Hampton sets the model of the vocational university that focuses on teaching trades. Similar to that would be Tuskegee University in Alabama. The other model would be the more traditional sort of liberal arts-centered education, where you would focus on the humanities and more classical learning. That model is associated with the HBCU in Nashville, Tennessee, Fisk University. This is the Emancipation Oak at Hampton that still sits on Hampton's campus, where supposedly the Emancipation Proclamation was read aloud for the first time in the South. particularly important because Hampton had become a contraband camp, where there were thousands of slaves there who, legally speaking, were contraband of war, i.e. not free. Well, post-emancipation proclamation, they are. Now, some considered the prospect that for there to be any real social revolution in the South, though, that there would need to be a program of land redistribution. In other words, if you were to continue with things as they were in terms of land ownership, all the land is owned by white people. And you had relieved them, of course, of their slave property, and those people are now free. But yeah, what are they going to do? Not all of them can up and move to a city and get a job. In fact, the reality was the majority of people would end up living on and working on that same land, growing cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. So some Union generals during the war thought, well, in order to effect any real meaningful social change here, what we should do is seize land from these plantation owners who, after all, are treasonous rebels and deserve to have their property seized, and parcel it out 40 acres, 40 acres, 40 acres for slave families. The idea that became known as 40 acres and a mule was what each slave family needed and deserved to get by. So that action was taken by some Union Army generals, including at one point Sherman in Georgia, and Abraham Lincoln reverses the policy. We tend to forget things like that because we want to consider people like Lincoln to be infallible saints who did nothing but great things. And it is almost never so. Lincoln and Johnson after him do not support such a policy, and even when we see the quote-unquote radical Republicans in Congress take over Reconstruction policy, even they never support a program of land redistribution. In other words, it never happens. Land is never systematically taken from slave owners, former slave owners, planters, and given to the former slaves. And they end up, in other words, as tenant farmers, living on and working on other people's land, which is to say white people's land, which is to say almost exclusively their former masters. Only now they should theoretically be getting paid a wage, which they, though, in turn have to turn around and pay their rent with a share of the crop that they raise. In other words, they are sharecroppers, which once they have done that and gone to town and gotten, what minuscule things they need for a minimum level of comfort and seed and supplies for the next year, they had nothing left. So it is a means of just getting by from which you could never escape. Even worse, you might have to leverage a portion of your future crop as credit to get some of those things in order to just get by, which you would then pay back at the end of the year when you paid your rent with a portion of your crop. And then you're really stuck. That's what we call a crop lien situation. Then you're stuck in a period of cyclical debt that you can't escape. And this is a situation the majority of former slaves find themselves in the decades after the war. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about the terms of presidential Reconstruction. What did it look like under Lincoln and then Johnson? Well, when I mentioned Lincoln sort of takes control of the situation during the war, he does this by issuing executive orders. The Emancipation Proclamation, in a sense, was one of those executive orders. So too, though, the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. An executive order issued by Lincoln, and that one word amnesty tells you its general characteristic. What is amnesty? It's like a legal forgiveness. In other words, the general characteristic of Lincoln's plan will be forgiveness for former Confederates. That is, they will not go after and prosecute high-ranking Confederate officials. They're not going to execute anyone for treason. Those people will be able to live out their lives as private citizens. At the core of the plan was the idea that former Confederates could swear an oath now to the Constitution of the United States of America. And so to repudiate, that is, go back on secession and the idea of the Confederacy, and to accept that slavery is over. So they would have to embrace the 13th Amendment, which is the legal instrument that actually ends slavery in America. That's it. You had once a certain percentage of people who had voted in the last American election or took this oath, they could then, the former Confederate states, set about forming new state conventions of these people who'd taken the oath. They could draft new state constitutions reflecting the fact that slavery is no more. And then they would petition Congress, ask Congress to allow them to re-enter the Union. Plain and simple. So, beyond a general amnesty, the major characteristic of presidential Reconstruction under Lincoln is leniency. Lenient. That is, easy on the South. Lincoln wants this to happen as quickly and easily as possible. Members of his own party, remember Lincoln is a Republican, feel like this is in fact way too easy or lenient. They want to punish the Confederate South for what they had done. They would like to ban ex-Confederate officials from being able to participate in that process of state constitutional convention, new state constitution, re-added to the Union. They want to ban those people from that process and ban them from holding office in those states or holding office in the U.S. Congress. Under Lincoln's plan, it wasn't a ban. All you had to do was take the oath. Well, they wanted to institute what was called back then the ironclad oath. Ironclads were the ships of the day. That is, they are wooden ships, but they're covered or clad in iron to make them stronger. So it's a way of referring to a much stronger oath, the key component of which was, I have always been loyal. I have always been loyal to the United States, meaning you would have to swear an oath that indicated you had not voted for secession, that you had not served in a Confederate office in the state level or federal level. You were not a sworn officer in the Confederate Army. You could have been an enlisted man in the Army, forced into service by the draft, but this would, in other words, the ironclad oath equals a ban on ex-Confederates. Because you couldn't legally take that oath if you had anything to do with the Confederacy. It would limit participation, in other words, to loyalists, people who had always been loyal to the United States and had not supported secession. It's a small number, but it's a number they felt you could rely on. These people become known as the radical Republicans that want a more radical Reconstruction, including not only that ban on ex-Confederates through the ironclad oath, but also guarantees for the citizenship rights of former slaves. Nothing in presidential Reconstruction beyond the existence of the Freedmen's Bureau addressed the plight or situation of former slaves at all. And the thinking was being, all these ex-Confederates are going to be in new state governments and they're going to ensure that former slaves are not citizens. They're not treated certainly as equal citizens. That there needed to be in Reconstruction some kind of guarantees that that would not happen. Does that make sense? Among these people are Charles Sumner, our old pal, who got beaten nearly to death on the floor of the Senate prior to the war. Senator from Massachusetts. Also, Thaddeus Stevens there, a radical Republican. Those are two of the most influential, but note that they are not young. And they're not going to be around much longer. And that's going to be important later. Consider two from Ohio, Benjamin Wade. And from Maryland, Henry Davis. Authors of the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis Bill, introduced in Congress, would have provided for the ironclad oath, the ban on ex-Confederates, and would have included guarantees for citizenship rights for former slaves. Now, the Wade-Davis Bill passed narrowly, but it passed in Congress. But it doesn't become law. You know why? Because Lincoln refused to sign it. He vetoed it. Lincoln vetoed the Wade-Davis Bill, and it does not become law. At that time, and I stress at that time, the radicals in the party didn't have the numbers to override his veto with a 2/3 majority. As we'll see, that will soon change. Well, Lincoln is, of course, assassinated not long after that, and Andrew Johnson becomes president. He's the vice president. The vice president, when the president dies in office, becomes the president. I don't think anyone seriously considered the prospect of Lincoln dying and this man becoming president. And if they had, they probably would have reconsidered him being the vice president. Johnson, interestingly enough, like the man that students invariably confuse him with, Andrew Jackson, is from Tennessee. And he was a slaveholder, just like Jackson. And he's a sort of come up from nothing, kind of rags to riches guy like Jackson. But just to be sure, go ahead and note that Jackson is dead and gone. And now we're talking about Andrew Johnson. But you may scratch your head here when we're talking about Abraham Lincoln's vice president in the final years of the Civil War being a former slaveholder from Tennessee. Now, why is that? Well, he was not Lincoln's first VP. They put him on the ticket in 1864 when Lincoln was up for re-election because, one, he was a loyalist. Here is an example of a man who could take the ironclad oath. He had not voted for secession. He had not supported the Confederacy. He moved to Washington when the war broke out. He manumitted or sold his slaves, I can't remember which. And they put him on the ticket as a way, this was at a point in 1864, just before Atlanta fell, and the tide of war had fully turned in favor of the Union. This is at a point where they could foresee winning the war and having to think about the possibility of reconstructing America. And they thought, what better way to show that we can put America back together again than by having a loyal Southerner as vice president. Again, probably without fully considering the possibility that Lincoln would be killed. And this man who, to put it generously, lacked the qualities that would make one an effective president. The idea that he could, in fact, become president. Historians routinely adjudge him to be among the lowest ranking of successful presidents. That is a kind way of saying the worst. Along with the man who preceded Lincoln, in fact, James Buchanan. And his handling of Reconstruction is going to result in essentially a congressional takeover of the process. And note that the members of Congress are his own party. Like, he can't even get on the same page as members of his own party. The number of people who we might consider radicals in that party is going to grow, though, in 1865-66. As the realities of what's happening in the South start to come to light. Under Lincoln's lenient plan of just taking the I'm now loyal oath, anybody more or less can participate, and then we have state conventions and new state governments and new state constitutions. Those constitutions have in them provisions that we call black codes, which the first sections of some of these, if you read only that part, you might think, oh, I see. This is setting out the things that former slaves can now do now that they're no longer slaves. But that isn't the point. If you get down to, sections 2 and 3, beyond that, you start seeing, former slaves or black people can't marry white people, they can't serve on juries, they can't vote in state and local elections, they can't carry firearms, they can't assemble in large numbers, they can only own certain types of property under certain situations, they can't testify against white people, and so on. Strict limitations, in other words, on the rights of former slaves as identified by the color of their skin. And it gets even worse in some cases. Some of these black codes go farther to have provisions for labor, such as stipulations that all wage labor must be contractual. And remember, most of these people working for wages are working as sharecroppers on land owned by white people. And these laws say, you have to enter into a contract to work on that land for a period of years, let's say 3. Well, what happens if that individual, who's now a free citizen, decides that they're tired of picking cotton and they want to move to Jackson or Memphis and go get a job in the city? Well, if they do that before the contract's up, that's not just a civil breach of contract. Black codes say that's a crime. And it's punishable by a huge fine, which was large enough by design that you, a sharecropper, could not possibly hope to pay it. And guess what the penalty is when you can't pay the fine? You get to work for your employer, that is almost always your former master, in the cotton fields in this case, for free. Which sounds a lot like... Yes. So the purpose of the black codes is to strictly limit the rights of former slaves and to recreate, where possible, the conditions of slavery. And under presidential Reconstruction, they're getting away with it. At the same time, you have the creation of terrorist organizations committed to upholding a system of white supremacy, most notably the one formed by former Confederate officers, the Ku Klux Klan. And yes, at the end of the war, there is the Union Army occupying the South, but the Union Army couldn't be everywhere at once. And wherever they were not, there was the Klan, making sure that black people didn't vote, making sure that what white supremacist Southerners called carpetbaggers, that is Northerners, whites who had come down at some point to the South during and after the war, couldn't vote. Making sure that scalawags or loyal white Southerners, like the kind who could take the ironclad oath if there was one, making sure that all of these people who would tend to vote for the Republican Party could not. And they do this through violence and terrorism. So the Klan is a terrorist organization committed to white supremacy. And at the time, as strange as this sounds, and we're gonna keep talking about American political parties and how they change over time, but the Klan was operating as a sort of terrorist wing of the Democratic white party in the South at the time, in that it is working against the interest of those who would vote Republican. And you'll see this in your document. Now, as members of Congress become aware of this, and more of them are radicalized by knowledge of what was happening there in the South, the radicals actually gain a majority of seats in the Congress in the 1866 midterm elections, allowing them to pass legislation without Johnson, the president's, support. You can override a president's veto with a 2/3 majority vote. And so they pass a Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which says you cannot single out a group of American citizens and say the law applies differently to them or they don't have the same rights. It establishes then the principle of, look here, the equal protection of the laws. The law applies the same to every citizen. To put it another way, with language from the original Constitution, we all share the same privileges and immunities of citizenship. You can't draw a line around one group of people, that is former slaves or black people, and say, yeah, well, you have different rights or you don't have all the same rights everyone else does. There's some question at the time as to whether Congress could sort of point its finger in this way at states in the Union and say, you can or can't make certain laws like this. Because this is aimed, make no mistake, at the black codes. And so the response from Congress is, oh, we have people that question whether this is constitutional. Well, then we'll just put it in the Constitution and then it'll be constitutional. So the Civil Rights Act of '66 becomes the 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Amendment, that says you can't deny people in your state the equal protection of the laws, and also, by the way, incorporates the language of the Fifth Amendment and applies it to the states. Remember, the Fifth Amendment says the federal government can't deprive you of your life, liberty, or property without the DUE, due process of law. You see it? Well, this says the state governments can't do that either. Because that's what the black codes did. Due process, equal protection, heart of the 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Amendment. I mentioned the '66 midterms. That's when the radical Republicans take over Congress. They continue to butt heads with President Johnson, who doesn't like what they're doing and would prefer to stick with Lincoln's Reconstruction plans of leniency and limited involvement. That struggle will culminate in Johnson being impeached by the House of Representatives. And the only reason he is acquitted in the Senate is because he agreed behind closed doors that he would step aside and allow Congress to take over Reconstruction policymaking. He, in effect, becomes what we call a lame duck president at that point. That is just kind of there, not of much consequence, at least when it comes to Reconstruction. Congress will then pass the Military Reconstruction Acts. These equate to a giant reset button on Reconstruction. Reset. Start from scratch. They eliminate the state governments that had been formed under presidential Reconstruction and start anew using, as a general rule, some form of the ironclad oath. In other words, there will be at least a temporary ban on the participation of former Confederate officials. And so this process of conventions for the states and new state constitutions and then appealing to Congress to get back in the Union, it would start all over again. So you would have to have the military in an occupation status as a temporary administration while that process played out. That's why they call it the Military Reconstruction Act. The South is broken up again into military administrative zones. And by the way, when you were drafting those new state constitutions, you had to abide by the terms of not just the 13th, but the 14th Amendment, so no more black codes. And when you petitioned to get back in the Union, you had to ratify the 13th and the 14th Amendment, and a new one, the 15th, which takes aim at the most important right that we have, the right to vote. The 15th Amendment guarantees to former slave men the right to vote. And no state could abridge that, as the black codes and many of them had done. I stress the word men because women file suit in federal court arguing that it ought to apply to women, both black, white, and otherwise, and the Supreme Court rejects that. And the women's suffrage movement will have to continue that fight into the 20th century. The States would have to ratify 13, 14, and 15, and you should be able to tell me on quiz or exam what those do. This ushers in, while the Union Army is in the South, while the activities of groups like the Klan, as we'll see, are being limited, while these laws are being enforced, this ushers in the period of black Reconstruction, as in the time where black people actually could vote, could hold positions of power, could get elected. And they do, all throughout the South. Those conventions to form new state constitutions, there are hundreds of black delegates. And in new state legislatures, there are even more black representatives in state legislatures. Even black majorities in South Carolina and Louisiana. And they send for the first time ever representatives and a senator to the United States Senate. Including a man who was a former escaped slave from Virginia who had become a captain in the Union Navy, a man named Robert Smalls, goes to the House of Representatives. This is the first senator, the first black senator here on the left from Mississippi, Hiram Rowles, who only serves for a year or so, but then we have another black senator, a mixed-race man, and a large landowner from the Mississippi Delta named Blanche Bruce. So, what went wrong? Between 1877 or so and the early 1900s, every single bit of that is reversed. By 1900, the South has become a South of white supremacy and white domination, in which there is virtually no black participation in the electoral process. That emblem was the emblem of the Democratic Party of the state of Alabama into the 1960s. And it says white supremacy for the right. And this could be the case for the white Democratic Party of the time throughout the South. Well, there was, of course, from the beginning, white resistance to black Reconstruction. They begin to craft a narrative that becomes a mythical history that historians call the lost cause. According to this mythical history, the South had fought valiantly in the Civil War, they say. But the odds were always against it. You know, they were outmanned and outgunned. And it was a lost cause, that it was a hopeless fight, but you had to fight it. And regrettably, so it goes, it was a war of aggression in which, by the way, they say had nothing to do whatsoever with slavery, which you know is not true. But a war of economic aggression of the North waged upon the South unfairly. And the old antebellum South, which is a world, by the way, which was ideal for everyone, including slaves, so it goes. But thanks to this war of aggression, all of that was gone with the wind. And then ushered in the period of black Reconstruction. And here the word black takes on a negative connotation. For they made up this lie that all of those black representatives and state leaders were incompetent and illiterate and didn't know what they were doing. And they were in league with carpetbaggers and scalawags who were nefarious, greedy liars. And this is a period in which they say law and order broke down. And so it was, thank God, they say, that a band of white-robed figures appeared on the streets like ghosts. And that this Klan didn't have to ride often, but it had to sometimes because bad men were doing bad, lawless things. And it was the Klan, they say, that restored law and order. and allowed the Democratic Party to redeem what they could of the old South. That is, to get back what you could of what was lost. That's a way of saying you couldn't go back to slavery, but you sure as shit could have white supremacy. That's the reality of what they mean when they say the redemption. They've been bringing an end to black Reconstruction and working towards, by 1900s, white supremacy. A total reversal. More than that even. And they achieved this through renewed violence. Now, prior to that time, throughout much of the 1870s, when black people were actually able to vote and elect those representatives, the Union Army in the South was operating under what they call the Force Acts. These allowed the Army to treat the Klan almost like an enemy combatant and to charge them with federal crimes and to have them sit in federal courts, that is not in local courts where they get acquitted by juries of their peers, but to hold them accountable for this violence through federal power. What we're going to see, though, is number one, gradually the Union Army is removed from the South and can no longer be this sort of police force, federal police force. And number two, the Supreme Court slowly but surely chips away at the power and meaning of the 14th Amendment, and by proxy the 15th Amendment. We're going to see case after case where the Supreme Court of the United States of America sanctions what was going to be white supremacy in the South. And it starts probably with the Cruikshank decision. This is in Colfax, Louisiana. It says Colfax riot. It wasn't a riot. And on the sign it says, on this site occurred a Colfax riot in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain in April of 1873. Well, the number was higher than that in terms of black people, and they were massacred. What had happened is they had won the local elections there in Colfax, and they knew that white people were going to try to undermine that and not allow them to take office. And so they took guns and occupied the courthouse, the seat of power in the town, their rightfully won seat of power, and assembled there, exercising their First Amendment right to assembly and their Second Amendment right to bear arms, for they had rightly won the election. Well, white people of the town armed themselves, including with somebody from somewhere drug up a cannon, surrounded the courthouse and summarily fired into it, murdering over 200 people, including about 50 of the last ones holding out that had tried to surrender. It's a massacre. Ulysses S. Grant was president at that time, the former Union general, and he was in league with the radical Republicans. He attempted to hold these people accountable in federal court, these murderers, using not just the 14th Amendment, but calling to mind, too, also the fact that these black men who were slain were exercising their First and Second Amendment right. And the Supreme Court rejects all of that. It says you can't use the 14th Amendment because the 14th Amendment is pointed at the state governments. And this was not the state. These are private individuals. So they got to be prosecuted by the state. Well, the state wasn't going to do that. They're going to get away with it. They're attempting to use federal authority, but the court says, 14th Amendment doesn't apply to the actions of individual citizens. Just state governments. You say, well, what about the First and Second Amendment rights? They say, oh, by the way, those only apply to the federal government. The Bill of Rights only applies to the federal government, not the state. So there is no state guarantee of right to assembly and right to bear arms. You could have taken from that decision that this court is not going to be a friend to the rights of black people in the South, and it definitely was not. While at the same time, there are changes in the Republican Party. We're talking about the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. People get tired of having to watch over the South and police that activity. pay attention to what's happening down there. People want to turn their attention west. Once the war is over, you can go back to that idea of a transcontinental railroad and settling the Louisiana Purchase territories, now Kansas and Nebraska, which, by the way, gold was discovered in the Sioux country of the northern parts of those territories. And then more gold and silver are discovered in places like Nevada. And you turn your attention to wars of conquest against those Indians and putting them on reservations so you can get those minerals. And you focus on building railroads and industrialization and new corporations and industries and creations. And you take your eye off the South. And then we have another case from the Supreme Court, the so-called Slaughterhouse Cases, which is another rejection of a 14th Amendment claim, and also dealing with Louisiana, where the Supreme Court steps in and again says the 14th Amendment doesn't apply in this case if we're talking about the actions of the states that are not strictly speaking vis-a-vis former slaves. This had to do with butchers in New Orleans. And the court says, no, it really strictly limits the focus of the 14th Amendment. And knowing that the court is sort of chipping away here and that states are kind of slowly but surely bringing back laws that would tend to limit the rights and opportunities for black people more broadly, the Congress passes a Civil Rights Act, another one, this one, 1875, that tries to establish the principle that you could not segregate by law what we call public accommodations. Public accommodations would be anything from hotels to streetcars or railroad cars at the time, public bathrooms, parks, libraries, restaurants, any public space. Civil Rights Act of 1875 says state governments can't do that, and the Supreme Court turns around in the civil rights cases, so-called, and says, well, yeah, you can. It overturns, it rules that the Civil Rights Act, was unconstitutional, which is going to embolden state and local governments in the South to establish segregation. At the same time, you had a presidential election in which some of the electoral returns were disputed, and just the electoral mechanics of it, it was going to be settled by a vote in the House of Representatives. And Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, cuts a deal with Southern Democrats by saying before the vote was held, hey, if you vote for me instead of your guy, I'll pull all of the remaining Union Army out of the South. In other words, this will be the end of Reconstruction if you elect me. And they did, and he did. And so after 1877, there is no more Union Army, American Army enforcement, that is to say federal enforcement of Reconstruction in the South. Combine that with the thrust of these Supreme Court decisions and with the resurgent activity of the Ku Klux Klan, because the Force Acts are moot at this point, because the Army's gone. Put all of that together and the door is wide open for white supremacist domination by way of the Democratic Party with the assistance of the Klan. And what they do once they take back control of these state governments, these redeemers as they saw themselves, is they draft new state constitutions. That is, they take the Reconstruction Constitution and throw them in the trash. And they have new ones in which they knew they couldn't go back to just blatant black code type laws, because there is, there's something left of the 14th Amendment, and there's the 13th and 15th. So what they do is more targeted. Jim Crow laws and disenfranchisement. Jim Crow laws step into the wide open window that was created with the Civil Rights Cases decision of the court and establish segregation of public accommodations all over the South. A man named Homer Plessy in Louisiana attempted to challenge this by deliberately riding in the whites-only section of a railroad car in his state, and argues in a federal court case that this law that established segregation on the train cars was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The resulting decision is Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the court infamously says it was okay to have segregation if there was the principle of separate but equal. As in, if you have separate facilities for black people, as long as they're equal to the white facilities, it's okay. This is a farce, and this is widely considered one of the worst decisions the court ever rendered. For the reality that surely they knew is that separate never was equal, number one, because number two, the whole purpose of separate or segregated was white supremacy. To be a daily reminder to one people that they occupy an inferior place in society to a dominant people, who are also daily themselves reminded of their own dominant position in society by way of segregation. It is in effect a way of trying to convince one people that they are an inferior people. And the court just said, it's all okay. And that decision will stand into the 1950s. At the same time, these newly controlled by Democrats state governments in the South begin the process of disenfranchisement. The franchise is another way of saying the suffrage, that is the right to vote. So if you enfranchise someone, as with the passage of the 15th Amendment, you're giving them the right to vote. If you disenfranchise someone, you are taking that right away. But again, you couldn't just do what you did with the black codes and blatantly say black people can't vote. But you could use violence again. You could use intimidation. You could engage in miscellaneous bullshit like closing registration places or moving them around. It could be, registration for voting is a local affair. It could be as simple as a white registrar seeing a black person coming to register and turning the sign around and saying we're closed. And it could include creating a Democratic Party that worked like a private club in which there was membership that was restricted to white people at a time when the Republican Party had so little support in the South after these decades of violence and intimidation aimed at it, that the only election that mattered is the Democratic primary. And if black people can't vote in that primary, they have no vote of consequence at all. The so-called white primary system. And then there were laws that you could enact, and you didn't have to use the word black, you didn't have to use the word white, you didn't have to use the word race. You could simply establish a law that creates a poll tax system. Establishes a poll tax. The polls or the polling places where you go to vote, a poll tax would mean you have to pay a tax to be able to vote. And if you missed it one year and didn't pay it, it accumulated and added up the next year and the next year and got higher and higher and higher. So that eventually you'd have no hope whatsoever of being able to pay that. Well, there are a lot of poor white people in the South, too. What could you do to ensure that this new poll tax only affected or kept black people from voting and not those poor whites whose vote you might want? What could you do? They established laws that say, or included these laws, well, if your grandfather was a registered voter, you're exempt from these new provisions. Now this is the late 1800s, early 1900s. What would be the significance of singling out someone's grandfather at that time? Well, if you're white, there's a pretty decent chance your grandfather was a registered voter, right? And if you're black, there's almost zero chance because your grandfather was probably a slave, right? And again, you don't have to use the word white or black. But it has the desired effect of allowing the poll tax to only be detrimental to would-be black voters. If that wasn't enough, you could establish literacy tests. Remember, at the end of the war, 90% of former slaves were illiterate. So what if you would require them to read and interpret some section of the Constitution for the registrar before they could be registered to vote? That would disqualify a large percentage of black people, even those who could rudimentarily read and write. Well, what if a white person came up and tried to register? Well, then the local registrar could just say, can you sign your name? Okay, you're literate. You can register to vote. So discriminatory use of a literacy test system. Discriminatory administration of a literacy test was a tool. And again, there's nothing in the law that says black or white. It has that effect without having to put that in there. If you thought all of this would be confined to the South, you'd be mistaken. Cities like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. have segregated streetcar systems. There's violence done to activists trying to rally the black vote in those cities and so on. And people like Harriet Tubman and William Still and Sojourner Truth and Octavius Catto have to fight against that. Now, it is not nearly as systematic as it was in the South, but it was a reality for people in those places too. Any questions about anything at all? Everything's 100% crystal clear? Well, in that case, next lecture is going to kind of overlap in terms of time frame with this one and talk more about industrialization in America, changes in America's economy, the birth of America as a sort of industrial power, kind of like what majority of Republicans were paying attention to when they were not paying attention to what was happening in the South.